folks. Welcome to the next edition of Serverless CrAIc. How are you getting on? Nice and
Okay.
toasty.
Nice and
All
warm in
good.
sunny Northern Ireland.
That's it. Enjoying blue skies, sunshine.
A rare occurrence.
Indeed, indeed.
All right, so we're still chatting about AI. So we figured we'd hit spec-driven development this time. It's like the whole next best action. The developer tool set is that I feels like it's changing a lot. Um, Spec-driven has really come into its own probably in this, what would you say, maybe 18 months?
Yeah, but maybe a bit less than that.
Mhm.
Yeah, maybe a year.
Yeah,
I,
it's
I
good.
think it's funny because in old money we used to call this executable specification,
Yep.
remember? And it was always a thing that you'd have a spec and something would read it and then generate code. So it's the idea has been around for a long, long time. Actually, well, way before that even. But it's definitely had a resurgence. And there's things that are different about it, but there's also a lot of things that are exactly the same. And I think people are not really understanding um, some of the problems that why this didn't, work in the past.
Yeah, there's definitely reminiscent around some model-driven development type activities going on that we tried 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Didn't quite pan out. So yeah, what's old is new again, I guess, in some of these things. But there are a
Mm,
lot of good, exciting things about this approach.
mm,
I don't think it's settled yet, and I think there's a lot of evolution and sort of maturity to go in this regard. But I'm excited about people sitting down and thinking about the problem space and thinking about their users and their needs and the context before they get into, just getting their agent or themselves just knocking out code. So there's a lot to be celebrated about who maybe never thought about this before or coming to the party now and actually trying to understand, well, what is my intent? How do I actually write this down? What are the needs of my users? And well, can I clarify my own thinking in a good enough
mm,
way to actually put it down on paper is probably something
mm.
good, right? That's
Because
what
guess what? If you don't capture a need, like there's no developers going to go, oh, I think that's what he actually meant. I'll just do that.
yeah.
If you don't capture the need, it doesn't get done.
Yeah. And,
Yeah.
and and I think why it's working now more than ever is you can pair up with an AI assistant of some sort and help clarify your thinking and help document some of these needs. In the past, maybe there was a burden of, oh, I don't want to spend so much time writing documentation. I haven't really thought through it properly, but you can pair and get it to ask you questions, help it to elicit some more context from you and understand what you're trying to do, or even bring in some other stakeholders. It's a lot more um, palatable now to actually
Yeah.
embrace a lot of this stuff, whereas in the past you might be like, I don't have the time or don't have the capacity or it'll take too long. Now this shortcuts a lot of that.
Yeah. I think it's a weird one. It's I started playing about with was it BMAD? It feels like it was towards the end of last year. It
Yeah.
was um it was originally breakthrough method for Agile, and now
Yeah.
it's build more architect your dreams or something. We changed it
Yeah.
to it's
I
so
get the it's
even
the
names
fella's name.
evolved.
It's the fella's nickname, so I think he just makes up something
All
that
right,
means.
B
But
so it's like
His
it's a
name's
brilliant
Brian Madison,
framework.
so fair
it's
fair
good
play
for
there.
it, but
Yeah,
but
fair play, yeah.
it's kind of one of those ones where, to your point, it's kind of like, you know, I think originally I tried to do too much too soon, and it just became really overwhelming, and I've had to reel it really back in. Like it's almost like I can get this stuff going, and I'm happy with it when I break it down to like task at a time type stuff, or it's there's a lot there, and I kind of feel like maybe that's where a lot of companies are starting to kind of realize with this is like, okay, you do the spec, but you need lots of different specifications, lots of different specs, lots of different sets of instructions. It is very difficult for that one person to do the fully in the end.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
so
But
it's
I
it's
think it's also been a very useful forcing function around your organizational information architecture and have you actually codified your vision, your standards, your principles, your values. Because whenever you kick off some of these, like BMAT and others, you're doing brainstorming or ideation or you're doing, product sort of development. A lot of the early questions are, well, what is your vision? What's your North Star? What are your KPIs? What's your intent? What's your values? So you're almost like stopping immediately because if you don't have those things, you're almost having to go off and think about, well, what is our value proposition? What is the return
Yeah.
on investment? What is the KPIs? So the more sorted your org is, the easier it'll be to do spec-driven development because you've got your context well defined. Then
Yeah.
it's a lot easier to say, hey, we're serverless first, we're well architected, we're domain-driven design, we're event-driven architecture. If
Mm.
you've all of those things thought through and codified up front, then it's a lot easier to have a really clear spec, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Plus, like spec-driven development is still incremental. Like the way we write software is incremental. Sometimes you change your mind about who the customer is, you pivot, you try something else. I mean, like even spec-driven development with an agent, you could incrementally be creating the spec over 6 months because you don't really know. Like
Perfect.
you tell me, like Adobe sat down one day and said, "Let's write Photoshop." Okay, that's it. What it is. Companies have spent decades incrementally building up what would be the spec. So it's completely unrealistic to think, Mike, that you could sit down. I know you're not thinking this, but like I'll write out the spec for something and then I'm done. That's the way we work. We
Yep.
we write specs and we try stuff. We go back and forward.
Yep.
You know, so I think it's extremely unrealistic to write a full spec and say,
Yeah.
right, quick, build all that stuff.
Yep.
It's not the way software's written.
And I think
Yeah.
there's a real advantage of these tools now is you can codify your initial first pass. You can then hand it off to the development agents to do the work, to test it, get you your fast feedback, and then you can go back to your original spec and update it again. Whereas in the past, that cycle used to take months or years for, hey, they've got this idea, we're going to hand it off to the team, we're going to do the work, or we're going to test it, we're going to get it in the hands of
Well,
real
drift.
users, and then it'll take
Yeah.
months for it ever to get back. Whereas now you can do that in a day or an
Like, remember
hour.
requirements drift? Remember requirements
Yeah,
drift and like requirements management? That was a
yeah,
whole like specialism, like where did you start off, but then you're in maybe
yeah.
year 3 or 4, and the requirements are a mess. They're
Yeah.
nothing like it.
Yeah.
So I think definitely iterative and incremental development of valuable functionality into the hands of real
Yeah.
users is
You want
still the
to
value here.
and keeping
Yeah.
those batch sizes small.
Yep,
No, I agree. I think that's definitely the lesson I've learned anyways, that if you go too big, too broad, whatever, you tie yourself in knots.
yep.
So yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
There's
And these
also
agents, they're also people pleasers. So
yep.
if you say, here's a massive spec to build a massive thing, it'll have a crack at it.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
but then you have to think about, well, who's reviewing your work and who's merging that PR and who's signing off on that release to production. If you break down your spec into small manageable chunks, then it's a lot more palatable and you get a faster flow of value. If you just have one big upfront spec and then you have 10,000 lines of code and a big PR, that's not sustainable.
Mm. It's funny. It's like all the old techniques of like BDD, behaviors of development, TDD, test driven, and even some of the domain driven stuff. I think they're all starting to come back again. You can kind of
Yep,
see them
yep,
coming back, but I think there's still a phase when we're trying to work out what are those techniques that were useful
yep.
that you can kind of carry forward. Well, here's a question for you. Who do you think owns the spec?
Well, it's a good question. And it's up for debate, I think.
Yeah.
Is the product manager? Is it the engineer? Is it the, I don't know, is it the developer? Is it testing? Who owns the spec? Is it everybody? Is it a
Well,
collaborative effort? Shared
who
artifact?
Yeah,
who
yeah.
approves it? Who approves it? Who says yes, let's go.
Well, I
Because
think
I
in the past it would have been like when we were doing like BDD and other things, when we are doing those scenario sort of workshops, it'd be a collaborative effort to try to
mm,
articulate what the behaviors are and what goes into the specification, right? What we
mm,
captured in those tests. So I do think it should be a shared artifact between your product, engineering, architecture, whatever, and it should hopefully be a nice balance between a lot of those competing
Mm.
concerns and with it's not just one stakeholder signs off on it. It should be like the team have been a collaborative part of refining and delivering that spec.
yeah. I
Yeah.
guess in a high performing team, like you'd say 100%, Mark. Like I think it's like in the good old days when you had to kind of, if you were lucky to have a really good product manager and you were doing impact mapping and you were kind of trying to work out like what are the different experiments, what are the different
Yeah,
hypotheses, then we'll enter a phase of example mapping and we'll kind of then, you'll use that to limit the scope and the work in progress and then we'll execute, we'll dispatch. But I still feel like that's still a very strong method of operation. And but you're doing that now. We're entering a phase of kind of, the software industry where you're going to be doing that constantly, you
Yep.
know. So,
Yeah. So I think there's a very important principle here. So I have a very strong opinion. I think the spec is owned by the tech lead in the team. It's
mm,
it's the senior engineer in the team who owns it because if you think of the spec as a set of instructions for the build, that has to be the top engineer. So it absolutely is a collaborative document. I think a lot of people have stakeholders and have a say in it. But I would think if a tech lead's not happy with a spec, it doesn't happen.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
we
Because they
shouldn't
can't
put it
stand
over.
over the build.
Yeah. I think we talked about this in the last recording around cognitive load and cognitive burden, right? If you get this right, you can have a reasonably good cognitive flow going through your team and you can minimize burnout. So I think you're right. I
Mm.
think there needs to be somebody in the tech lead saying, no, it's not clear enough, it's not good enough, it's not aligned to our standards. Go back to the users, understand, go back to the product, try and understand more because this spec isn't clear enough.
well,
Mm.
would you agree? Like, I don't know what you're seeing, but there's way more in the specifications when you're operating this way, right? Like
It's more than a
in the
PRD. You would have
yeah,
thought the PRD, the product requirement document, is written by the product manager. People think, well, that's the spec, but you're right, that's not enough.
no,
I think that's still a valid document. You don't have to write a PRD, but some like it's
Yeah,
not a waste of time,
yeah.
but
yeah,
it's an important input into the spec.
Yeah, and we'll maybe touch on this later, but there's a whole context development life cycle that we need to factor in here around, well, what
Mm.
repo is it in? What's your standards for that language? What are your SDLC standards that you want to apply? These are all things that need to be articulated or codified or linked to in the spec as well.
yeah.
What's your releasing cadence? What's your release process? Right? All of those things are context that you want to feed into this specification as well. So you're right, Mike. I think there's a lot more in it because you can put a lot more in it now.
Yeah, I think that's no 100%. Like even when you think about it, you start off with what's the functional specification, like what are the requirements, what is the problem we're trying to solve, and then you'll kind of enhance that with okay, well, what's the security
Yep.
specifications, what's the integration specifications, like, and you'll continue to kind of add these things up to the point where you do have the I think you're right. I think you have the point where you go, yeah, this looks right, accept this, and you're almost doing that in an abstract form because you're at that point where you're going to hand off to the development agent, right? Or you're going to, and then Mark, you kind of get into your point. It's like, okay, how does the engineer or the development agent interpret the specification we've just produced?
Yep.
So I think you do have to, I think you kind of have, and that's the other kind of philosophical side of this is do we do this because we want to be happy that we're shipping something that this actually looks in line with what we want at an organization and at an architecture level. Um, and I think with that, sometimes it's like, maybe down the line, what does that look like?
Mm.
Do we have more liberal, more creative? How far outside the lines are we letting these things go? But at the minute, it's a really important part of the sort of keeping these things constrained.
I know in a lot of the spec-driven development frameworks like SpecKit and others, they then take that spec and break it down into like implementation tasks and plans and
Mm.
other artifacts. And like we've all been probably experimenting and reading about all the different ones. There's like SpecKit, there's Orbis superpowers, there's compound engineering, there's BMAD, but there's also then the emergence of the actual native harnesses. Like, Claude
Mm.
and Cursor also have their own sort of spec-driven
Mhm.
planful sort of mode as well. So I think a lot of this is still evolving rapidly and it's up for grabs, but I think some of those core concepts still hold true,
Mm.
right? The whole BDD,
I,
TDD, domain-driven design, understanding your context, working in small batches, iterative and incremental stuff. I think they're all still are going to be more important than ever.
mm. I do think, I mean, just briefly, I think I read a nice article, it was last week about systems of delegation. It was saying about is the unit of work changing? It's like people would say like a story is 5 points, and then you measure my velocity as 5 points. So I get that story done in like I don't know maybe 2 days or something. So that's a measure of a throughput or developer productivity, whatever. But if an agent can do that really quickly, I think it's a different because maybe there's more time spent in the discovery or preparation of the spec
Yep.
and less time spent on the actual construction. Maybe there's more time spent on the verification that
Yep.
it's right. So I think the way we know the way we're going to delegate to these things is going to it's really going to mess up, I think, develop productivity
Yeah,
because it's you're measuring different things. That's
Mm.
story points were always stupid. You know what I mean? That's just it's just
yeah,
throw that out there, like.
yeah,
But I think they're really going to be exposed in this new world.
yeah. I think
Mm.
there's measuring the clarity of intent, what you feed in to the process, and then there's the
Yeah.
verification and validation on the what's coming out of the process. You need to invest heavily in both of those. So we mentioned it briefly, but context development lifecycle. Do you have your context all versioned and distributed and source controlled and managed,
Mm,
and you're able to distribute that to all your different agents? And do you have comprehensive unit integration, chaos testing, end-to-end testing, all of those things so that you have really good verification and validation of what comes out the other
Mm.
end. I think, those two sort of bookends of this whole process are going to be more important than ever.
yeah,
Mm.
big time. And then all the standards about that stuff, which like I think we trying for years to maybe improve the front end of development and then the sort of the back end of development, but it's always been sort of like, oh, that would be nice if we had our requirements tidied up, but we don't have time. We're just going
Yeah,
to build stuff,
yeah.
So I think it's a fascinating time.
I do think with all the tools and all the capabilities and all the learning vehicles that we now have, like Notebook L and all the things, we can raise the standards higher than we've ever raised them
Yeah.
before because the burden of getting to that standard is a lot less, but the tools will help you get there. So
Mm,
we can
Mm.
say we want to have a well-architected, serverless first, event-driven architecture, and we can give that to these tools, and they will get a fair way down that road to deliver you a solution that's close to that. Now you have to build all
mm,
the rigor and discipline and all the processes and bring people on the journey, but you can set really high standards now for really good unit end-to-end integration, chaos testing, and you can get your agents to go and get you most of the way there. That's a huge shift, right?
mm.
That's the, I mean, that's the thing, right? So the specification is at the heart of this, right? So it's kind of like the specification's almost like here's all the things that we want to build, but then you have to do the whole how do we build it all around it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
that's what you guys are saying. That's where you kind of have to then work out what works for you and your, I don't want to say context, but you say you and your org or you and your setups. Like, um, like if you're in something like Cursor or Claude, how do you step your way through that process to get to the point, to your point, Mark, how do we measure that outcome? Like, and it's where do you apply that context? What skills do you apply along the way when you kind of go from point A to point B to point C? And
Mm.
it's I think that's where the real I think where that's where a lot of the craft and this stuff
Yeah.
resides. I kind of feel like, because I've seen scenarios where you try and throw way too much context at something, and or you're throwing not enough, or you haven't scaled out the approach to a
Yeah.
specific task
Yeah.
to your getting to you know your specifications. Kind of like I still feel like we're all learning
Yeah.
that
Yeah, big
and
time.
it's
Yep.
evolving quite a bit,
Well, they
and
yeah.
yeah.
Well, they show how crazy it is. Like, I mean, I have two statements that I think are kind of funny. Um, the first is imagine you could measure how good a development team is by the quality of the requirements.
Mm,
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't sound like a bad thing. Like, but any engineering team would say that's nothing to do with it. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? Like that's completely alien. They're like, well, that's a nice to have, but like with a whole bunch of different stuff we do. And then the second statement is imagine you could measure how good an engineering team was by how good their tests are.
mm,
That's a bit more reachable. But
mm,
there's plenty good teams that are shipping good software, but their tests are maybe they know they've slipped, you know.
mm,
Yeah, because
But
they've made trade-offs and there's a context there that they've prioritized time to market or time to value over comprehensive tests, and that could be a very
yeah,
valid judgment call. But the measures may look totally wrong for them. So if
yeah.
they're getting judged by some third party who doesn't understand that context, then it's very hard to justify, right?
The measure's been
well,
on the middle bit, but
Yeah,
again, we have to figure out. Like, I don't even know. It's easier to measure good testing. Well, it's still controversial, but It's very hard to measure good
yeah,
requirements.
well,
100%.
And I know
it's
requirements is like it's like old money, but
Well, there was that whole thing. There was an interesting article. I think there's probably going to be a series of them from ThoughtWorks. Is it, Dave? I think you might have shared it, but I've seen it like the from Brigida,
yeah.
ThoughtWorks, and it was
The
about like
harness one
eye and
or the
sensors
sensor one, yeah, yeah.
And it's a real strange time because like I've experienced both sides where the technology itself empowers, you know, like I always kind of feel like it's a good sense of maturity of a team when you meet them, how mature their testing strategies are. And I mean that by they don't apply everything with a pyramid or with a diamond. It's kind of like what are we building and what's the most sensible way to test it? Where's the risk? Like how do we get confidence in this as a good solution? Um, but now with this sort of technology, you can see like you've experienced scenarios where everything becomes an end-to-end test, a black box test, because it's so cheap now to kind of spin these up and test it from the outside in. And then that to me is really kind of it's coming from like I do have a good testing background, but that's it can be really irritating for me. But then philosophically, those have been really expensive to run in the past, and they're still really expensive to run, in my opinion. But is it the incorrect thing to do? Like so again, everyone's trying to work out like what now that it's becoming cheaper to do certain things. Does that make it more
Yeah.
feasible? Um, at what point's good enough? Because it is cheap. Not you can spot it, you can fix it, you can correct it. Like so. There's a whole new thing we're learning, and I think it's just through experimentation and trying not to kind of it's actually been really difficult to remain, like open-minded. You have to unlearn all your okay,
Yeah.
yeah, okay. I'm gonna leave my I'm gonna remain open-minded to this approach, but I still feel like we should be applying smarter testing strategies.
100%. I still think code as a liability applies here as well.
We covered that the other week, yeah,
Exactly.
100%. But um,
That article is called Harness Engineering for Coding Agent Users. It
hmm,
was published just at the start of May 2026. And she's got a nice thing as well on it, which is a nice mechanism. I hopefully it survives, but it's nice. But there's feedback and there's feed forward.
hmm,
So feedback is things you get when something happens, and feedback is like the context that you put into it. So
Yep.
there's a whole bunch of really interesting. I think
Yeah.
it's the inception of something very interesting.
Yeah. And
But
you can start to see the emergence of almost like these, like I know Kaparthi put out auto research, but it's almost like I have this input, I'm going to do this spec-driven development process, I have these outputs, and I can then iterate and iterate and iterate until I get the context perfect
yeah,
for getting the results that I want, right? So
yeah,
there's
yeah,
there's elements of that certainly come through as
the
well.
double loop, yeah.
that's mad. Like so, and I'll go back to the spec stuff. So good friend Patrick Dubois, who's doing work with Tesla now on some of the. He had a nice article he put out a while ago about the four kind of descriptions of spec driven. So it might be interesting to maybe run through those.
Yeah, he's done a load of great work on. There's a whole series of articles on the Tesla blog on contact development lifecycle and spectrum developments. Well worth a
Yeah,
read. It's very insightful stuff about where this is going. But yeah, I think the
fantastic work.
four are
Yeah,
spec first, spec driven, spec sourced, and spec aligned. And
mm,
again, as we mentioned, all of this is evolving rapidly. But I think spec first is before you do any sort of agent work or any coding, you sit down and collaborate over a specification document, right? And you outline your constraints, your requirements. You write it all down. And I think up till now, the lingua franca was Markdown, but I see HTML starting to make a
yeah.
make a resurgence again. So
Well, HTML for output. I think Markdown still for input, but it's
yeah,
still even the fact that that's changing. I mean, even hear people talk about going back to JSON again, like
yeah.
which I
So
hope that
so at,
doesn't
at the
happen.
time of recording, May 25th, Markdown was the go-to, right?
Yeah.
And then spec driven is your
But before
AI
you move
agent.
on, like spec first, that's very sort of big design up front,
Yeah,
isn't it? Like it's like you figure out what you need and write it all down, then you're
yeah.
sorted. So
And I think maybe that's okay if you're like just getting started, or if you're like a green field, you haven't thought it through, and something like BMAT helps really do the brainstorming and understanding that. So you can maybe do that, for that. But
well,
once you
for
get into incremental development, it's probably
yeah.
too heavy with.
But the cost of that, I mean, the big thing about big design up front is once you finish your big design. Then you go into construction. That's very, very expensive.
Yeah,
Now you can write your design and you can just throw it at an agent and see what happens and then start again.
yeah,
So that's a big difference. So maybe a big design up front isn't as terrible as it used to be.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then the spec driven is more around where you're going through like a workflow with the agent. right? So it's helping you clarify it. You're asking clarifying questions. You're helping to back and forward. Hey, have you thought about security? Have you thought about cost? Have you thought about the users and their needs? So there's and I think some of the frameworks have that baked in anyway now. So even the spec first and spec driven, they're sort of kind of together, right? They help guide you through that workflow to come up
Yeah.
with a pretty comprehensive
It's
spec.
like the advanced
Mm.
elicitation methods, I think that the BML
Exactly.
talks about. And
Which is
I
very
actually
good.
like those. I found this to be very useful because, it asks you something that you need to sit and put down some time, but you let the agent ask you lots of questions and you're like, oh, I forgot about that. You're like, no, it's not important. But it will throw up a load of stuff. It's very, very thorough when it does that.
Yeah, and then spec sourced, where the specifications are machine readable and really are the system of record for the system, right? So this is where you're really keeping, the spec is the truth and the only truth, and everything else is sort of throwaway, right? I think is that one.
Mm. And
Um,
ADRs are quick. The original intent for ADRs that live with the code. I mean, that was kind of like this, and it wasn't as automated,
yeah.
but similar concept.
But there was and a bit like I know Simon Worley and others have said in the past, if you have a really comprehensive proper tests, you should be able to throw away the implementation and recreate the system from the test alone, making all the tests
Mm.
pass. Right. So there's a little bit of that where, hey, our specs are good enough, are so good that you could throw away the implementation and we would get the same working software at the other end of just from the specs. I think is
Mm.
where that one comes along. Where and then the last one here is spec aligned, where it's a constant iterative loop where it's basically keeping both in sync, your spec and your implementation. So it's keeping it sort of aligned to each other. But again, there's burden and there's overhead with that, and there's a lot of basically you have two systems then you
Mm.
need to keep in sync, which is
And that's almost like saying the code is the spec, and there's a person friendly version that's genuine that you can read.
yeah.
You know what I mean?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so where do you think you are today? I definitely think the code is still my source of truth, but maybe that's up for debate.
Um, it's kind of interesting. Um, it's weird because all software is all software projects are different, right? Some of them are large, some of them are small, some of them are continuous. And I think depending on what scenario you're in, you can probably, you know, I'm trying to think like what one would be if you're a team and you've got cursor and you saying, right, this is a feature I need to kind of build, and so you'll probably go into that. Maybe it's either one of the first spec driven, and you'll create your plan. And so one of those things where you're kind of wrestle with is when you create the plan, you almost kind of do it in an abstract way, where you want to hand it to a dev agent. So really, does that become your specification? So that's probably um,
Like I do think
probably one or two, yeah, spec first or spec driven.
the spec source is interesting because even again some of these terms are probably still up for debate, but having the previous record of that spec as code as your lineage of decisions might be okay to keep that around so you can understand more of the context. But
Yeah.
if you're not using it to keep the code in sync, then it's good as a historical artifact. At this
Mm,
point in time, we here was the spec, here's what we did, here's the changes we made, and now we've got that version, but it's in an archive somewhere, right? And you can go back and
Mhm.
look at it, whatever. That's not too bad. I think you can then look at the history and you can sort of reason about it. But again, there's lots of additional context now that's in your repo, that's in your code base.
mm.
That
Mm.
then there's a cost for any agent that's looking at your repo. It's going to maybe look through all those specs. That's more
Well,
cognitive load for
because
the agent and for
because
yourself.
because 100%, because I think at that point in time, that's kind of useful for the build and sort of what you're engineering. But the output of the engineering of it should be you should be kind of producing other specifications, right? API specs, event specs,
Yep.
data specs, and I think that's what maybe, from a historic, you guys mentioned are your tests,
Yep.
so you've a lot of kind of things there that kind of get persisted post
Exactly.
implementation. And I think it's useful to keep the plan and my experience, my limit, like we've been doing this well, like this year, but what we started to see is like where did the plan go wrong? You
Yep.
know what I mean? Like the specification and what feedback would we give? And then how do we tighten up that process? So it's almost like that, that what did you say earlier? The fail forward or the move,
Yep.
carry forward stuff. So
Feed
there's
forward,
definitely
yeah.
things where you can learn. you
Yeah,
know?
100%. Like you'll update your Cloud MD file or you update
Yeah,
your long-term memory, and then the next iteration through it'll remember, oh, I need to do that engineering
yeah,
thing, right? Um,
100%.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. I mean, I think it's still too messy. It's still too early.
yep,
I think there's a lot of focus will be on the harness, that harness engineering
yep,
piece of it. That like people are still designing the harness, being like the model, like the workspace with all the context and the files and
yep,
specs, everything else. That's still a lot of work going on in that space.
100%.
I mean,
Yeah.
that idea of either harness-driven development or context-driven development. I think it's lots of interesting ideas, but I don't think anything is one yet.
Yeah,
Mm.
and I don't think you want to get too wedded to any one particular framework at this point in time. Use them,
No.
take advantage of them, get the value out of them, but don't be afraid to pivot and experiment with new things. Something we haven't talked about is the supporting engineering operations around this stuff, right? We touched on
Mm,
it a little bit, but a lot of these things need to be linked to Jira or GitHub issue. You need to be tracked. You need to run all your sort of your DORA metrics, all that sort of stuff. That's all evolving as well around this, right? So as these things change, then all of their traditional practices about what it means to be an elite team and how you measure and how do you create an environment for success, they're all going to have to adapt to this new world as well. And I don't think that's been
Mm.
no,
really worked out yet at all.
I think the definition and the flow of work is fundamentally changing.
Yeah,
And it's not just about generating the code. There's a whole system of work that's evolving in front of us. And there's some things that won't survive, I think,
yeah,
from the old world. Some tools that won't survive.
Mm.
But I don't think it's been figured out yet. One thing that
Mm.
will survive is people in the middle of it,
yep,
because it's going to be bloody complicated.
100%.
Um, but I think the system will look very different.
There you
Very
go.
good. Well, that's a crack then. Surely with that, we're getting deep there. Um, would you give us a click on the Serverless Age at the YouTube channel or in LinkedIn or at serverlessage.com. And thanks very much. Much
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
appreciated.
everyone.